Pleased today to be joined by Oklahoma Secretary of Energy and Environment, Ken McQueen. Mr. Secretary, good to see you.
Scott, it's great to be with you this afternoon.
Let me start off by some things that are going to be in the news. And I think a lot of people know, of course, that you were a Tulsa grad, a TU grad in petroleum engineering, and then you were in New Mexico and really equivalent years ago to what you're doing now in Oklahoma for Governor Stitt. But there's going to be a movie out in a few weeks, and it's going to be, for history nuts like me, I can't wait to see it. I think I bought my ticket, which is the Oppenheimer movie. And as Secretary of basically energy in New Mexico, and we used to have a place in New Mexico. We weren't that far from Los Alamos. I mean, our American history, there's going to be 40, 50 years worth of Americans are going to be educated by this movie. We'll get their history from that, right? And what happened at Los Alamos and what happened at the Trinity site. Well, you were director of the energy policy out there for the governor in New Mexico. Your thoughts about what's about to happen in terms of Americans going, wow, that happened here. They don't read a lot about this. It was a fascinating time in American history led by Robert Oppenheimer, and interesting more so in terms of what happened in the 50s after he became the father of the atomic bomb. But I know you're interested in the movie, but give us an idea about what's happening in New Mexico now. We wanted to talk nuclear here in just a moment, nuclear energy. But as secretary out there, you got to oversee a lot of activity and a lot of exciting things happening in that region.
That's right, Scott. When I was cabinet secretary in New Mexico, we were the third largest producer of crude oil in the United States. They've continued on that trend, and they've now surpassed North Dakota to become the second largest producer in the U.S. They have the second largest number of rigs, about 100 rigs deployed now working in the Permian Basin. And they are continuing to develop down there like nobody's business. So their oil production now is approaching 1.8 million barrels per day, and they could very well get to 2 million barrels per day by the end of 2024 if they keep up this pace. So New Mexico is doing more than its share to supply the energy needs of the U.S. economy today.
Have you personally been to the Trinity site, which would be obviously part of that movie where the first atomic bomb was exploded?
I have been. New Mexico is a second home for me. We still have our home in Santa Fe, which is just down the hill, as they say, from Los Alamos. I think people will be surprised when they see the Oppenheimer movie until you actually visit Los Alamos. And by the way, they have a wonderful museum there that's free for everyone to visit. It's just unbelievable what the folks were able to do out there in such a short time. They developed two different types of nuclear weapons. They carted one of those down to the Trinity site where they exploded it before dawn one morning in August of 1945. The site is only open 2 days a year for visitors. It's one day in October typically and one day in April. It's on the test range down there, so they have to close and secure the facility for visitors to come in and see it. But it's a super interesting site, and because 1945 is now so many years ago, I think lots of people just aren't familiar with the history that these guys from back east all went out and took over a boys' school at the top of the hill at Los Alamos, set up these labs, and did really what is amazing work, amazing physics they got done in a very short amount of time, and ultimately helped bring an early end to World War II.
I think the last time I saw many stories about Los Alamos was, I think we still had a place there, which was, there were some fires threatening that area. This has probably been a decade ago. And then there were a lot of stories about Los Alamos and things that happened there. I probably should, before we get into Oklahoma, I should probably ask the following question. As Secretary of Energy, the equivalent there in New Mexico, where do you keep the alien spacecraft that you guys got at Area 51? I mean, do you know where they're at? Can you tell us exactly where the alien corpses are, all that sort of stuff?
Well, that's down near Roswell, but you have to have a top secret security clearance for that. So if I told you, I would probably have to kill you.
I don't want that. And, people are talking about secure documents. I don't want to touch it at all. So that sort of thing. Well, it's fascinating. So it's going to be interesting to the Oppenheimer film. And people are going to see this and they're going to go, you can go to the Trinity site. And yes, you can. And it's been on a couple of times we've attempted, just weren't able to do it because it just happens, once a year basically. So,
It's a fascinating site. I would encourage people to go. You can still find pieces of sand on the site that were melted together from the heat of the device explosion. It's really quite interesting place if you're a science buff like I am. I really enjoyed the trip down there, and you can get on the website and double check the days that they're open, because it doesn't fall on the same day every year, but typically 2 days a year, once in April and once in October.
Yeah, I'm fascinated about that. Isn't there a name for that sand? Isn't it called Trinitite or Trinite or something like that?
It is. That's exactly it. It's a very interesting kind of a bluish green coloration to it, and they have some samples you can see. They actually have Geiger counters there, and when you put the Geiger counter close to that substance, it ticks, so it's still got a little bit of radioactivity there.
I'm sure we can find it on eBay. Find them. I'm just kidding. Probably not. Well, enough about New Mexico. As fascinating and I love that state, and my whole family kids grew up there on the ski slopes there. So we love New Mexico, but that's something, the amount of oil that's produced there, that's like 3 times what Venezuela puts out now. It's just an amazing amount. But also Oklahoma is really moving up in terms of oil and natural gas, correct?
That's right, Scott. Oklahoma now ranks 4th in the U.S. behind Texas, New Mexico, and North Dakota. We're the 4th largest oil producer. We're last I looked was about 425,000 barrels of crude oil production per day. So that puts us just a bit ahead of both Colorado and Alaska in oil production. Well,
go Oklahoma. That's always great news. So no war on fossil fuels, as people say, in the state of Oklahoma. So that's great news. And oil and natural gas, the bridge to the future. So let's take a moment and talk about the future, if we could. Some legislation that was passed this session, which goes back to, I believe, some 2009 legislation. Carbon sequestration is one of those terms that people are starting to hear, but we've not seen a lot of media about that in Oklahoma. So it's a bridge to the future. Let's discuss, if we could, Mr. Secretary, what carbon sequestration is, how it affects Oklahomans, how it affects the world, and also what this legislation does this year that really puts Oklahoma in that game.
Well, there's been a Carbon Sequestration Act on Oklahoma statutes since 2009. It's really not been utilized since it was enacted back then. But what happened last year with the federal regulations and incentives that took place was that the tax credit for carbon sequestration, permanent storage of carbon in the subsurface, the incentive of that was increased from $50 a metric ton to $85 a metric ton. And so that really moved the needle for the economics of a lot of projects that were considering permanently sequestering their carbon in the subsurface. So the Biden administration has been very much pushing this forward. We want to take advantage of it for a number of reasons. First of all, we have new businesses coming to Oklahoma asking what our carbon sequestration capability is. It really represents an opportunity for some economic development here in Oklahoma. It's important for Oklahoma to be competitive with surrounding states, which are also working on their carbon sequestration. And we have a great workforce talent already trained dealing with carbon dioxide transport here in Oklahoma because of their expertise with enhanced oil recovery in Oklahoma oil fields. So this past legislative session, because of this increased interest, Senator Rader introduced Senate Bill 200. And this bill requires a report out of our office working with some of our agencies, Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, and Oklahoma Corporation Commission and Oklahoma Geologic Society, to look at the existing 2009 statutory framework and see if that is still appropriate for how things have developed in the last 14 years. And then ultimately, what we plan to do after we complete that work and make any necessary statutory changes is to submit an application for EPA for program delegation for carbon sequestration in Oklahoma. The EPA has oversight for all underground injection. It's basically called their UIC program, Underground Injection Control. And there are 6 classes of UIC wells that are permitted under EPA. And Oklahoma currently has a program delegation for classes 1 through 5. So class 2, for example, would dispose of oil and gas waste. Class 1 is hazardous material. Class 3 is solution mining. So class 6 is designated for carbon sequestration. And Oklahoma currently does not have program delegation, or what we often refer to as primacy, for carbon sequestration in Oklahoma. So what this means for companies that are interested in doing carbon sequestration in Oklahoma is that they have to go to Dallas EPA Region 6 and go through a federal permit in order to sequester carbon and qualify ultimately for the carbon tax credits. So by securing this program delegation, we will be able to both regulate and provide permits for carbon sequestration in Oklahoma. And we believe that Oklahomans are much better able to permit and oversee the carbon sequestration than our friends at EPA in Dallas.
Now, where you've been in your career.
Yes.
But in other words, so you're going to be closer to the government to get permitting to do this. Is EPA fine with that?
Yes, the EPA really operates under 3 major environmental programs: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Safe Drinking Water Act. And each of those 3 large environmental statutes allow states and Indian tribes, for that matter, to apply for and achieve primacy. And basically, the foremost requirement is that your rules and regulations have to be at least as protective as what's provided for in the federal statutes. And so most states have secured primacy for a large number of these subsets for these 3 large federal environmental regulations. And that's true in Oklahoma as well. We have a number of delegations already in place from EPA. They actually encourage state delegation, and so that's what we're working toward. Currently, there are 2 states. North Dakota was the first state to achieve program delegation for Class 6 UIC. Wyoming was the second state to achieve that. Louisiana just recently had their application published in the Federal Register, so they're well on their way to getting primacy. I know that the Texas Railroad Commission is working on their application, and here in Oklahoma, we'll be working on our application as well to get that down to Dallas as soon as we can.
Will that corporation commissioner, will there be an existing agency that has this authority? How will it work out?
That's a great question. Under the current 2009 Act, the responsibility for carbon sequestration is actually split between the DEQ and the Corporation Commission, and it depends on what type of reservoir is being utilized for the sequestration. We just had our first stakeholder meeting this morning, looking for public comment on ways we might improve the Sequestration Act, and that was one of the suggestions that was mentioned this morning. Is the commenter believed that the program would work better if it was entirely under DEQ or entirely under the Corporation Commission. So that's something that we're going to take a hard look at, and it will probably be one of the recommendations that come out of our report back to the legislature.
If we could step back for just a second, some people are going to go, what in the world are you talking about? It sounds like carbon injection wells. I mean, is that kind of a simple way of putting all of this into perspective about what's going on here?
That's pretty much it. For the last 40 years or so, the oil and gas industry has injected carbon dioxide into their reservoirs for enhanced oil recovery operations, but that CO2 is cycled back to the surface and separated and then reused for multiple times. The significant difference here is that we're looking at permanent sequestration so that the CO2 is put in the ground and permanently stored there. The tax credits that are available fall under a section of a federal tax code called 45Q. In order to qualify for those 45Q tax credits, you have to submit and have approved from EPA what's called an MRV. It's a maintenance reporting and verification plan for your carbon sequestration. And once an entity gets that, then they can qualify for the tax credits. But the tax credits offer potentially significant amounts of revenue that can be utilized, as a future business opportunity. So Oklahoma has a lot of sedimentary rock. Out in the Anadarko Basin, we have 30,000 feet of sedimentary sections out there. And so from the perspective of having a lot of sedimentary rock, which is typically our first choice for storage medium, we have a lot of places to look in Oklahoma for potentially storing this carbon. And the reason for the carbon, of course, is the attempt to control carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So the credits are good for about a 10 or 12-year period. I really view carbon sequestration as kind of an intermediary step in looking at carbon reductions. It buys us some time to consider other energy sources, as we move into the future. And so I think it's going to be a great opportunity for businesses who are interested in do that. Some because of the increase in federal tax credit, some companies are actually looking at direct air capture, which are called DAC units, to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and sequester it. So there's a lot of interest going on in carbon sequestration. Typically, CO2 is pressurized. CO2 is one of those compounds that has a peculiar phase behavior. And so if you increase pressure on CO2 to about 1,000 pounds, it behaves as a fluid rather than as a gas. And so this is how most people handle CO2 for sequestration projects, because fluid handling is much easier than gas handling. So you can pump the fluid rather than compress the fluid. And so that will be, I think, kind of the shape of things to come. But it's really aimed at storing large volumes of carbon dioxide in the subsurface permanently.
Another thing you've been working on, notably working for several years and successfully, it appears, is this Project Halo. And Oklahoma starts looking at hydrogen, creating blue hydrogen, and companies coming here. Give us an idea about where the project, first of all, if you could help us go over what Project Halo is with our friends in Arkansas and Louisiana. It has to do with hydrogen, making these hydrogen hubs. A lot of people say there's the future, especially for big transportation. But it's very exciting. Oklahoma's on the forefront, and there's been a lot of work. Your predecessor was also involved in this, Secretary Wagner. And so it moves forward. I think there's been a couple of successful steps. We're looking at the fall of finding out if Santa Claus is going to come. So give us an idea about what's happening with this project, how it fits into the overall aspect of the state administration, more of the above, as you like to say, all and more of it, about how this is going to impact Oklahomans who may not be seeing or reading much about this project.
Well, as part of the federal legislation that was passed last year, the DOE has made $8 billion available for their hydrogen hub project. I find that the hydrogen hub definition is really kind of a misnomer. Really, it's an intent to create a hydrogen ecosystem across the country. So we were one of 79 projects that initially applied. Those applications were due last November. The 79 applications were reviewed. 33 were invited to submit a final application. We fortunately were one of those 33 applications. That final application was submitted to DOE on April 6th. Our ask for DOE was $1.25 billion. They have said that they expect, they're required to fund at least 4 hydrogen hubs. They said more likely they will probably split that $8 billion to fund somewhere between 6 and 8 hydrogen hubs. So our application is in, it's pending. Just this past week, we completed about a 2-week exercise of following up with questions that the DOE reviewers had on the application, and we've submitted that material back to them. Their initial application process said that they would have a decision by fall of 2023. What we're hearing is they may have a decision as early as September of 2023, which will be great. We had almost 100 different companies participate in conjunction with Arkansas and Louisiana and ourselves in developing the concepts around the hydrogen hub. We've recommended funding a number of projects from those companies that in the submittal that was made to DOE. We see this as a consistent effort in our energy philosophy here in Oklahoma. We need more of the above. We need all of the above. And we want to fully take advantage of these funds, which may be available from DOE, and fully explore the opportunities that this new frontier in hydrogen may offer for us.
Why is hydrogen so important?
Well, that's a great question. You know, hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. Our problem on Earth is that it's combined with many other substances, most commonly with oxygen to make water. So hydrogen is abundant, it's readily available. Our challenge, quite frankly, is it takes a fair amount of energy input to separate hydrogen into a pure compound. The advantage of hydrogen is that when it burns, the byproduct is water. There's no CO2 emissions. So that's really the great attraction for hydrogen as a fuel. It's also a fairly high energy intensity fuel. So when you burn hydrogen or when you use it in a fuel cell, you get a lot of bang for the buck. It's fairly easily to compress into a liquid, and the liquid volume of hydrogen offers about 10 times the BTU as what the equivalent volume would be in gas. So I think that's kind of the answer of where we're headed, in particular for heavy haul transportation. If you look at our 18-wheelers, really you've got two choices for fuel. If you look at a decarbonized choice, that's batteries and that's hydrogen. And batteries don't work well in heavy haul trucks because to get very far down the road, the weight that you have to have on board to supply the truck significantly offsets the amount of cargo that you can carry. So while electricity works well in EVs, in transportation automobiles, it's going to be a much bigger challenge in trucks, simply trying to address how you get from point A to point B. Hydrogen, on the other hand, if you store liquid hydrogen on an 18-wheeler, you can think about 800 to 1,000 miles between refueling, and that's competitive with what we see in the diesel environment today. So I think, hydrogen has a lot of potential uses. Transportation, I've just described some of the uses there, but There's also a lot of interest in hydrogen as a key component of generating fertilizers. All of the ammonia fertilizer starts with hydrogen, and there's been some interest expressed in creating green fertilizers. And then ultimately, there's interest in using hydrogen as a fuel for generating electricity. One of the most interesting aspects I find about hydrogen is that you can mix a little bit of it, 10 to 15%, with your methane input for power generation. You actually get a disproportionate decrease in emissions from that mixture, because the hydrogen helps to better ignite the methane. It's kind of like putting gasoline in diesel to get a fire started. So I think when we think about the demands that EPA are considering right now for reduced emissions from power plants, that may be one very logical place to look, is replacing some of the natural gas with a small amount of hydrogen in order to improve the emission profile.
I know our time is short, and we appreciate your time today, Mr. Secretary. Let me ask, or close by asking the following question. You are also the Secretary of Environment, Energy and Environment. Other things that your division is doing that Oklahomans would find interesting right now?
Well, we have a whole array of environmental activities that are going on in the state right now. I would say probably the one that's been in the news most significantly of late is the decision from Judge Frizzell on the Illinois River Basin and the phosphorus contamination that's been going on there. I think that's something that we're watching very closely, and working in conjunction with the Attorney General on positive outcomes for Oklahoma. Our water resources are critically important to this state. Just ask anyone that lives in Rogers Mills County or in Cimarron County, where water is in short supply. And I think everyone will testify to the fact that plentiful water, clean water, high quality drinking water is an important resource that we've been blessed with here in Oklahoma, and we want to make sure that we continue to protect as we move into the future.
They've actually been getting some water in Roger Mills County and Cimarron County, and places that our New Mexico days, we travel across the Panhandle and see rain out there. Doesn't happen all that often.
Yeah, I think they were dancing in the street in Boise City.
I think so. And that's perfect, because people, that it's not Boise City, it's Boise City. You always know the out-of-towners when they talk about Boise City and Miami, Oklahoma.
That's right.
So you're like, okay, all right, where did you come from? Well, Secretary Ken McQueen, your office is magnificently doing great things for Oklahomans. I'm always reminded of George Jetson. You're like George Jetson if George Jetson were real. Things that are happening over there. I hope you'll visit with us often, because there's just so much news coming out of there, and it's getting harder to find, but it's ironic because there's so much news, so much good news coming out of the Secretary Ken McQueen's office. It's just something we should check back often, and I hope you will.
Thanks, Scott. We'll look forward to the opportunity. Great to be with you today.
Thank you, sir.